The moment a 25% tariff was announced on Canadian agricultural exports, this stopped being political theater and became a structural stress test. On paper, the move looked aggressive, a clear message, a warning shot meant to force compliance. But in reality, it exposed something far more dangerous than weakness in Canada. It exposed how deeply the United States depends on a supply chain it does not control. For decades, Canadian agriculture, especially processed potato products, has been quietly embedded inside the American food system. Frozen fries, potato flakes, industrial inputs, feeding fast food chains, supermarkets, and processing plants across the country. This was never a marginal trade flow, it was a backbone. The tariff was framed as strength. But tariffs do not punish exporters first, they punish systems. And this system was integrated, optimized, and fragile in exactly the wrong place. A 25% tariff does not magically create new farms, new processing capacity, or new logistics overnight. It simply adds friction to an existing machine. And when friction is introduced into a high-volume, low-margin food supply chain, the costs do not disappear. They cascade. What followed was not Canadian panic, but American exposure. Contracts suddenly became liabilities. Inventories tightened. Prices began moving before consumers even understood why. And the most uncomfortable truth emerged quickly. The U.S. could not replace Canada at scale, at speed, or at quality. This was the core miscalculation. The tariff assumed Canada needed the U.S. market more than the U.S. needed Canadian supply. That assumption was wrong, and Canada knew it immediately. Which is why the real story is not the tariff itself, but what Canada did next. To understand why this tariff failed, you have to understand Prince Edward Island. PEI is not just a regional farming hub, it is one of the most efficient potato production ecosystems in the world. High yields, advanced processing, tight disease controls, logistics built specifically for industrial food chains. For American buyers, PEI wasn't just cheaper, it was predictable, consistent, scalable, and that matters more than politics. The U.S. food system is optimized for reliability, not redundancy. Processing plants are calibrated to specific inputs. Restaurants rely on standardized products. Distribution networks are tuned to volume and timing, not improvisation. Remove a supplier like Canada, and the system doesn't adapt, it strains. That is why domestic substitution was never a short-term option. American producers could not instantly match Canada's output, processing depth, or cost efficiency. Even if land existed, even if farmers expanded, even if capital flowed, processing capacity takes years to build. The tariff ignored this reality. It assumed that supply chains respond to pressure like political actors do. They do not. They respond to physics, infrastructure, and time. As Canadian shipments slowed, American processors were forced into renegotiations. Restaurants faced cost spikes. Retailers passed prices forward. Consumers absorbed the difference. And suddenly, the pressure flipped direction. Instead of Canada being forced to concede, American industry began lobbying for relief. Quietly at first, then urgently. This was the point where leverage shifted. Because Canada was never trapped, Canada had options. And the moment the tariff made the U.S. market economically irrational, those options became strategy. What looked like restraint from the outside was actually calculation, and the next move would prove it. When the tariff took effect, Canada did not retaliate with speeches or symbolic countermeasures. It did something far more disruptive. It reduced exposure. Shipping millions of tons of agricultural products into a market burdened by a 25% tariff would have meant selling at a loss. That was not resilience. That was surrender disguised as compliance. So Canada chose withdrawal. Exports south were cut. Contracts were paused or rewritten. Shipments were redirected before they crossed the border, not in panic, but in sequence. This decision was not emotional. It was mathematical. Margins in food processing are thin. A tariff of this scale does not compress profit, it eliminates it. And once profitability disappears, volume becomes a liability instead of an advantage. By pulling back, Canada protected farmers, processors, and logistics partners from absorbing structural losses. There were no emergency bailouts, no chaotic dumping of excess supply, no race to the bottom. Instead, the system stabilized. Government support programs acted as shock absorbers, ensuring that reduced U.S. access did not translate into financial collapse at home. Cash flow was preserved, employment remained intact. Processing plants continued operating, but with a different destination in mind. This was the critical pivot point, because while American buyers scrambled to adjust contracts, Canada was already reallocating capacity. The tariff was meant to force Canada back to the table. Instead, it removed the U.S. from Canada's immediate calculations. And once that happened, the leverage was gone. The pressure Washington expected to apply never arrived because Canada had already stepped out of range. While the focus remained on North America, Canada was moving west. Asia was not a contingency plan. It was an acceleration. Urbanization, rising incomes, and the explosive growth of international food chains had already created surging demand for high-quality frozen fries and processed potato products across China, Japan, South Korea, and Southeast Asia. What changed was timing. The tariff removed hesitation. Canadian producers shifted production lines to meet regional preferences. Packaging was adjusted. Shipping routes were re-optimized. Containers that once crossed land borders now moved through ports. And then the contracts followed. Multi-year trade agreements were secured worth billions, offering stability that the U.S. market, suddenly politicized, could no longer guarantee. These were not speculative deals. They were long-term supply commitments designed to lock in volume, price, and reliability. At the same time, processing facilities accelerated investment. Automation reduced labor risk. AI-driven sorting improved yields. Data analytics optimized inventory and logistics planning. Sustainability initiatives, biogas from waste, water recycling, recyclable packaging, cut operating costs while strengthening environmental credentials. This mattered because Asian markets are not just large, they are demanding. Quality control, consistency, and sustainability are not optional. Canada met those standards at scale. By the time American buyers realized the shift was real, capacity was already allocated elsewhere. This was the quiet brutality of the move. No announcement, no headline confrontation, just contracts signed, ships rerouted, and influence redistributed. What began as a tariff dispute had become a permanent reconfiguration of trade flows, and the United States was no longer at the center of the system. The consequences arrived quietly, but they were unavoidable. As Canadian supply vanished from the system, American processors were forced into emergency adjustments. Frozen fry inventories tightened. Long-term contracts had to be renegotiated under pressure. Spot prices moved first. Menu prices followed. For restaurants, especially large chains built on standardized inputs, substitution was not simple. Switching suppliers meant recalibrating processing specs, taste profiles, and logistics timelines. That takes time, and time costs money. Retailers passed those costs forward. Consumers noticed it not as a headline, but at the checkout. Higher prices, smaller packages, reduced availability. No explanation beyond vague references to supply issues. Behind the scenes, the political dynamic flipped. Industry lobbying intensified. Food service operators, distributors, and processors pressed for relief, not because of ideology, but because margins were collapsing. The tariff had not created domestic capacity. It had created operational risk. And that was the moment the narrative broke. What had been sold as economic pressure on Canada was now being experienced as self-inflicted disruption inside the United States. The supply chain proved far more fragile than political rhetoric suggested. Canada, meanwhile, remained stable. Exports were flowing, contracts were secure, farmers were protected. The system was functioning, just no longer centered on the U.S. The tariff had not forced compliance. It had forced exposure. This episode was never about potatoes. It was about leverage. Tariffs are loud, they generate headlines, they signal resolve, but they only work against countries that lack alternatives or lack the discipline to execute them. Canada had both. Instead of reacting, it planned. Instead of escalating, it diversified. Instead of absorbing losses to preserve access, it redefined where access mattered. That is the difference between political theater and strategic power. The United States learned an uncomfortable lesson in interdependence. You cannot threaten a system you rely on without damaging yourself. You cannot replace years of infrastructure with weeks of rhetoric. Supply chains respond to preparation, not pressure. Canada's response preserved livelihoods, strengthened global partnerships, and reduced exposure to political volatility. Farmers were shielded, processors modernized, trade influence expanded. The U.S., meanwhile, faced higher costs, logistical instability, and the realization that coercion cannot substitute for capacity. The narrative of dominance was replaced by a narrative of foresight. In a globalized economy, real power is quiet. It is built in contracts, infrastructure, redundancy, and execution. It does not announce itself, it simply moves. Canada showed that under pressure, the decisive advantage does not belong to the loudest actor, but to the one who is prepared. Threats may make headlines. Strategy shapes outcomes.